Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. When I was in college, self-development as an umbrella term was one that most people would not have recognized. There were people, increasing numbers of people who were into it. Esalen was a big part of that, the human potential movement. So those were some terms that people would recognize. But it hadn't really gone mainstream yet. As of 2023, yoga as an industry, as a global market, was worth $107 billion with a projected growth of 10% a year after that. And that's only one aspect of self-development. How things have changed. And yet, in a book that James Hillman put out with Michael Ventura, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse. He claimed that too much focus on the inner world was actually bad for the outer world. It led to things like political decline of interest, which he had said elsewhere too. Hillman, by the way, was politically active. He was known to go to city council meetings. He voted. He talked about being a Democrat. I was discussing that with him once, and I said, so over the next year between now and the national election, what are you planning to do? This is some years ago. And he said, well, I'm going to gather up a group of people and lock up all the wealthy Republicans on their golf courses so they can't vote. Hillman was prone to a certain amount of exaggeration, which he was fully aware of. I joked about it with him once. And I don't think he really believed that focusing on oneself was a major contributor to the decline of the world. But it was a factor for him. In the U.S. election of 2024, 1/3 of the electorate didn't vote. So we got Trump. As part of that, I did some numbers on this. There was a bit less than 80 million people who voted for Trump. The number of nuns in the United States, and I don't mean cloistered, I mean NONES, the people who claim no religious affiliation when they're asked in surveys. So those are the spiritual but not religious people. That's the biggest block. And then there's some agnostics and atheists mixed in. That number is about 86 million. They're actually the largest religious group in the U.S. If they had all voted, the outcome might have been different. Actually, if only even half of them had voted. So it's interesting for me to talk about this because I've been involved in the self-development arena since my 20s. I've done all kinds of it. Meditation, which I still do, I Ching, which I still do, tarot. I love the symbolism. I have done Tai Chi Chuan. I have taught some things along those lines in higher ed for about 20 years. Depth psychology, mythology, ecotherapy, you name it. So I'm familiar with this. And I continue to teach for Young Platform. I have classes on managing narcissism and codependency, among other things. And so I'm a believer in self-development, obviously, or I wouldn't have been involved in it for all these years. But I'm understanding, and I have understood this for a while, that it needs to go outside of what we think of as the self. And as some of us are now aware, some of these self-development techniques have been taken from cultures that don't see the self the way we do. Yoga for thousands of years was primarily a spiritual practice. In the U.S., it's mostly about health, although it has many spiritual adherents and teachers as well. But the idea of the firmly boundaried self is very Western, and it reaches an extreme in the United States, where for millions of us it looks an awful lot less like selfhood and more like selfishness. And like what the philosopher Gabriel Marcel said was preoccupation with inward perfection. And of course, I've seen a lot of that over the years in my circles. Some years back, I inadvertently pissed off a Jungian practitioner with a question. We were discussing Jung's concept of the anima, the feminine component of a man's mind. And there's been a lot of criticism of this part of Jung's theory, the essentialism of it, um, among other things. There's other problems. But anyway, this practitioner took the anima concept very seriously. He had a group of young men he was working with, and he was proudly talking about how these men were, getting into their feelings and writing poems to their anima and things like that. And he kept using the term the feminine. And I hadn't meant to be disrespectful, but I said, out of curiosity, how do these men do with, actual women? Like, do they have difficult conversations around patriarchy? Do they talk about power relations? How do they get on with actual women? And he got really defensive. Well, they're working up to it. They're working up to it. They have to do their anima work first. And I was like, how does that work, though? I mean, there are some things you only learn by doing them, right? You have a tough conversation, you fall on your face, and you learn from it. So anyway, I wonder if those guys are still out there doing anima work. Maybe it's helpful. I don't know, but I've done some of my own, but I've learned on my own that it doesn't replace actual relationship. And by actual, I mean with human beings and not just with archetypes. I think in some ways, this kind of reasoning that, you have to love yourself first before you love others, or you have to work out your inner stuff before you're ready for a relationship. I think this is a very introverted way of looking at the world. And as an introvert, I can appreciate it to a point. But if we step back from it, we can see, I think, also the limitations of that kind of introverted take on things. Because the introvert, when you're introversion, especially when it's unconscious, you kind of want to do everything at home. You want to do everything on the inside. Because there you can sort of control things. Whereas the outer world is kind of this big scary place and who knows what's going to happen. So I think to some extent being unconsciously introverted or excessively introverted satisfies safety needs, or at least it appears to. But of course in the long run you're less safe and not more. Because you're not learning things that you only learn by colliding with other people. There's other people in the self-development arena, which is a big tent, who recognize this and have been taking the work out into the world for some time. I've got to work a bit with Kwame Scruggs, for instance, and I really admire his work. I've worked a little bit with Kelly Carlin, some others. I really enjoy my Young Platform classes because although they're very focused just on self-development and not really on improving things socially in the collective, they're fun to do. They allow me to get into my extroversion with audiences, and we do Q&A, and that's actually the fun part for me. I do like to prepare my little lectures for them, but that keeps me interested for maybe 40 minutes, and then I start getting bored. So we really learn through dialogue, as Plato realized. We learn by talking to each other. So I'm getting a chance to experiment with all this. I think of it sometimes as extroverting self-development. self-improvement, self-realization, because there's this split that we have in our culture. And Hillman, I think, was speaking to this a bit, where on the one hand, we've got a lot of people out there doing very extroverted reform, activism, hard political work, community work, things like that. And they're really tired, um, especially in the US right now, but other places too. Really tired. They're working hard against autocracy, against all kinds of obstacles, barriers, injustices, you name it. And they don't really have the internal resources that they need, let alone the external ones. Activism is a chronically undersupported work, underpaid too. So we've got all those people on the one hand, and on the other, we've got all of us who've had the privilege of studying ourselves and doing all these methods and techniques and all the rest of it, watching our dreams, meditating, doing yoga, on the other hand. And the two don't talk to each other that much. They do occasionally. There's the spiritual activism piece that Alka Aurora brings to the world. Other things too, but what I'm going to experiment with, and I just got a grant to do this, is to create something I've mentioned in previous podcasts, a kind of deep wisdom institute, studying deep wisdom, trying to practice deep wisdom outside of the academic world. And so we're going to bring these two groups together and include some others. So, for instance, I know a lot of people on the self-development side of the house who would love to be able to help make the world a better place, but don't really see how. And these are people who have gotten over the omnipotent magical fantasy that doing inner work automatically improves the world. I wish I could remember which seminar Jung addressed that in, but he laughed at it. It was just a brief throwaway comment, but he said something like, "You think shadow work's going to wake everybody up?" Or I'll have to go looking for that and find it again. It was a brief comment, but or individuation work maybe is what he said. Anyway, those things do make a difference on some level, but what a lot of us are realizing, and this aligns well with Hillman's criticism, is that it's not enough. It's important, and we should do it, and it's not enough. So one group I want to work with a lot at this academy is the self-development group, people who have gone through all these great programs and workshops and everything else, and now they want to put it to public good in a way that's suitable for their own strengths. It may not mean knocking on doors. It may mean doing something else, some kind of mentoring, for instance, quiet mentoring. It may mean something along the lines of Catherine Savella's excellent podcasts on myth. So if you haven't heard them, look up Myth Matters. Catherine Savella, Svela. She brings in other kinds of stories too. So this merging of worldviews and practices, what might that look like? Well, here's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I'm thinking about somebody specific I know who I would like to hire for this. What if you did dream work with activists? How might that help? What might that teach them about what they're doing, about how the world needs them, how the world calls out to them? I'd like to do parapsychological work with activists, and I have in class, actually. What about teaching leaders, and I've done some public presentations on this, what about teaching leaders that inspiration is all important? Inspired people will do anything. They'll overthrow empires. They'll build new religions, new industries. What if leading with inspiration was something that you could actually cultivate? So that'd be a piece I would bring. What about active imagination for all these groups, leaders, activists, educators, healers. What might they learn from active imagination? What might they learn from Jung's observation that imaginal characters have their own reality and tell us important things all the time? So I'm finishing up the last of the grant proposal now. I'll keep you posted on where it goes. They've already said they want to give me money to do this. By the way, the name is going to be Pronoia Academy. So pronoia has a couple of different meanings. The psychological meaning in ordinary English usage is that it's the opposite. Pronoia is the opposite of paranoia. Pronoia is this feeling like you belong in the cosmos, you belong on the planet with other people. That's one meaning of pronoia. That's the most recent meaning. As far as I've been able to find, pronoia shows up in her first incarnation in Greek mythology. She's the wife of far-seeing Prometheus. And then she appears later in Gnostic mythology as a goddess, a wisdom goddess, so in some ways similar to Sophia, who descends into the lower world again and again in order to bring her light down there. She has shown up in my dreams occasionally, and there's not a lot said about her even in the Gnostic tales, but the confusing thing about Gnosticism, one of the confusing things, is that there are several goddesses who basically are wisdom goddesses, but they go by different names. Epinoia, Pronoia, Protonoia, Sophia. Eve is a mortal version of them, a messenger of light from the above. Noria. So, Barbilo, I should mention too. These are all basically not just wisdom goddesses, but the feminine pole of the divine, which is beyond gender, beyond concepts, but can nevertheless be represented in these different figures, what Jung called personification. So wisdom, the divine pole of God, big mind, whatever you want to call it, occasionally takes the form of Pronoia. So I thought it would be a good tribute to her to name this academy after her, since it's being set up in her spirit, hoping to bring a little bit of her light out into the world, a world very much in need of wisdom. So my term for that, by the way, which won't surprise you, is pronoian wisdom, the kind of wisdom that goes out in the street, gets out of the classroom, works in the world. It's a form of applied wisdom or engaged wisdom. I was actually going to call it engaged wisdom at first, in a nod to Thich Nhat Hanh, but the term's already in use. There's a program that set it up in relation to some sort of, it's part of a degree program somewhere where the emphasis is on engaged wisdom for talking to extraterrestrials. So if you want to talk to extraterrestrials, that might be your path. It isn't currently mine. I'm open to the whole idea, by the way, and have said so in public before, but that's not what engaged wisdom means to me. So anyway, the term's in use, so I switched to something else. So an academy for helping people, counseling people, mentoring people with what Maslow called metapathologies. Pathology is an unfortunate word, but basically sicknesses of the soul, people who need support, people who need to be more in touch with things like enchantment and meaning, purpose, and spirit. We don't live by bread alone. And I'm thinking that with more of those in our life, more beauty, more wisdom, perhaps we'll do a better job of not only taking care of this ailing planet we live on, but in the long run, perhaps providing it with more effective forms, more humane forms of governance, finance, education, religion. something actually worthy of a living Earth, floating in a living cosmos. So that's the big picture behind our much more modest beginning point with all this. So I'll keep you updated. Thanks.